The photographs were still warm from the developer when Dennis Rader slid them into the envelope, his fingers lingering on each image like a collector admiring his work. For 31 years, Wichita held its breath. 4 families destroyed in 1974, then silence, then more bodies, then decades of nothing but whispers and double-locked doors. The BTK Killer, bind, torture, kill, had become the city's longest nightmare, a ghost who sent letters to newspapers and vanished into suburban normalcy. But here's the thing about monsters. They don't actually disappear. They just get very, very good at hiding in plain sight. Dennis Rader grew up unremarkable in every way that mattered to the outside world. Born in 1945 to working-class parents in Pittsburgh, Kansas, oldest of 4 boys, scout leader material if you looked at the surface. But even as a child, something was already broken inside. He tortured animals, cats, dogs, anything small enough to control. He'd hang them, strangle them, watch the life drain from their eyes. His mother would later say she never saw any warning signs. That's the thing about predators, though. They learn early that the mask is everything. By his 20s, Dennis had crafted the perfect camouflage: military service, marriage to a nice church girl named Paula, 2 children, a job installing security systems, which meant he had legitimate reasons to case neighborhoods, to learn which houses stayed empty during the day, which families left doors unlocked. He was studying everyone, learning their routines, and in 1974 he was finally ready to act. The Otero family never had a chance. January 15, 1974, Joseph Otero, 38, his wife Julie, 34, their daughter Josephine, 11, their son Joseph Jr., just 9 years old. Dennis had been watching them for weeks. He knew the father's schedule, knew the mother stayed home with the younger children. He cut their phone line before dawn and slipped inside through an unlocked door. What happened next lasted hours. Dennis had brought rope, tape, plastic bags. He told the family he was there to steal their car, that if they cooperated, no one would get hurt. It was a lie. He'd never intended to leave witnesses. He forced them into separate rooms, made them watch each other's terror. The methodical cruelty of it, that's what would haunt investigators for decades. This wasn't rage. This wasn't a crime of passion. This was a man who'd planned every detail, who'd brought a camera to document his work. When it was over, he masturbated at the scene. Then he drove away in his own car, leaving the Otero family car untouched in the driveway. Because it had never been about robbery. It had been about power, about proving to himself that he could become God over life and death. 3 months later, he called the police to make sure they'd found his work. His voice was calm, almost bored. "You will find a homicide at 803 North Edgemore. That is correct." The city reeled. 4 people dead, including 2 children, and the killer was calling to gloat about it. The newspapers dubbed him BTK after he sent them a letter describing his methods. "I like to tie them up and have complete control," he wrote in his cramped handwriting. "The victims are ties up, tortured, and then killed." But then Dennis Rader did something that would define the next 3 decades of terror in Wichita. He disappeared. Not physically. He went to work every morning, came home to Paula and the kids every evening, attended Park City's Christ Lutheran Church every Sunday. He coached his son's baseball team. He volunteered with the Boy Scouts. His neighbors thought he was maybe a little odd. He was obsessive about his lawn, militant about city ordinances. But odd isn't illegal. Meanwhile, BTK was evolving. 9 months after the Oteros, he struck again. Catherine Bright, 21 years old, shot and stabbed in her own home while her brother Kevin fought for his life. Kevin survived, but barely. He'd been shot in the face, left for dead. When he managed to crawl to a neighbor's house, he became the first person to see BTK's face and live. The composite sketch showed an ordinary-looking man, brown hair, average height, the kind of face you'd forget 5 minutes after seeing it, which was exactly what Dennis Rader had spent his whole life cultivating. The killings continued, but sporadically. Shirley Vian in 1977 strangled in front of her children. Nancy Fox that same year found posed on her bed. Each crime scene told the same story: meticulous planning, ritualistic violence, a killer who was becoming more confident with each murder. And then BTK began his psychological warfare against the entire city. The letters started arriving at newspapers and TV stations. Rambling, self-aggrandizing manifestos where he gave himself credit for murders he hadn't committed and described his crimes in nauseating detail. He seemed to crave recognition almost as much as he craved killing. "How many do I have to kill," he wrote, "before I get a name in the paper or some national attention?" The FBI profilers painted a picture of a narcissist who desperately needed validation, someone who felt invisible in his daily life and used murder to feel significant. They were right about everything except the most important part. They had no idea who he was. Because Dennis Rader wasn't some loner living in his mother's basement. He had a wife who adored him, children who called him Dad, a steady job, a church community, a position on the city compliance board where he zealously enforced parking violations and barking dog ordinances. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. By day, he was hassling his neighbors about tall grass. By night, he was reliving his murders through souvenirs he'd taken from the victims: jewelry, driver's licenses, photographs. He kept them hidden in his church, of all places. God's house serving as storage for the devil's work. In 1979, he killed again, Anna Williams, but she wasn't home when he broke in, so he waited and waited. When she didn't return, he left empty-handed but frustrated. The hunt itself had become almost as intoxicating as the kill. His final murder came in 1991. Dolores Davis, 62, found dumped under a bridge. By then, DNA technology was advancing rapidly, and Dennis seemed to sense that his window was closing. So he did what psychopaths do when they feel threatened. He went dormant. For 13 years, BTK vanished again. Wichita began to exhale, cautiously. Maybe he was dead. Maybe he'd moved away. Maybe the nightmare was finally over. But monsters don't retire. They just hibernate. In 2004, the 30th anniversary of the Otero murders brought fresh media attention to the case. Television specials, newspaper retrospectives, renewed calls for tips. Dennis Rader watched it all from his living room, and his ego couldn't stand being forgotten. He started communicating again. Letters to the newspaper, a package left in a public park containing Anna Williams' driver's license. After decades of silence, BTK was demanding his spotlight back. The police played along, but carefully. They'd learned from other cases that engaging with serial killers could be dangerous. It fed their narcissism, encouraged escalation. But it was also an opportunity. Dennis had been careful for 30 years, but pride makes people sloppy. The correspondence continued for months. BTK would drop packages in random locations around the city, always containing some piece of evidence from his crimes. But he was also asking questions. Could the police trace a floppy disk? Could they track communications from a computer? Detective Lieutenant Randy Stone made a decision that would end the longest manhunt in Kansas history. He lied. "No," he told BTK in a newspaper ad, "we cannot trace a floppy disk." Dennis believed him. On February 16, 2005, he left a purple floppy disk in a Wichita park. The disk contained a deleted Word document that revealed its last user, Dennis Rader, Christ Lutheran Church. One Google search later, and the 31-year mystery was over. They arrested him at his home on February 25th. Paula Rader was at work. She'd had no idea. None of them had. His children, his church, his neighbors, everyone who'd known Dennis as the slightly irritating but harmless compliance officer learned simultaneously that they'd been living alongside one of America's most notorious serial killers. The trial was a spectacle, but not for the reasons you'd expect. Dennis chose to plead guilty, but his confession became a grotesque performance. For hours, he described each murder in clinical detail, his voice never wavering, never showing remorse. He corrected prosecutors when they got details wrong about his crimes. He seemed proud of his precision. "The victims were tied up, tortured, and then killed," he said, echoing his first letter to the press 3 decades earlier. "That's where I get the name BTK." Paula Rader filed for divorce immediately. His children changed their names. The man they'd called husband and father had never really existed. He'd been BTK all along, just wearing their lives as another disguise. The judge sentenced him to 10 consecutive life sentences. Kansas had no death penalty at the time of his crimes, so Dennis Rader will die in prison, which is perhaps fitting. The man who craved attention above all else will spend his remaining years in solitude, forgotten by everyone except his victims' families. But the real horror isn't Dennis Rader behind bars. It's the 31 years he spent free. 3 decades of church potlucks and little league games and neighborhood barbecues, all while the families of 10 people lived without answers. All while a city lived in fear of a ghost who was hiding behind the most mundane mask of all, suburban respectability. Now sit with that for a second. Your mailman, your mechanic, your kid scout leader, the man who complains about your fence height or reports your barking dog. How well do you really know the people who orbit your daily life? How many Dennis Raders are out there, waiting for their moment, perfecting their masks? BTK thought he was too smart to get caught. But in the end, it wasn't forensic science or brilliant detective work that brought him down. It was the thing that drove him to kill in the first place. His desperate, pathetic need to be seen, to matter, to be remembered. He wanted to be famous. Now he is, in the worst possible way. A cautionary tale about the monsters who live next door, mowing their lawns and attending PTA meetings, while darkness grows behind their eyes. The real boogeyman isn't hiding under the bed. He's hiding behind a badge, a uniform, a friendly smile. He's hiding in plain sight.